Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, the true story of how a street cat named Bob saved a man's life and changed it for the better. James Bowen, played by Treadaway, is a homeless busker in Covent Garden who is battling his addiction to heroin. But his drugs counsellor Val, played by Joanne Froggatt, believes James has it in him to be clean. She arranges for him to be given supported accommodation, and soon after he moves into his flat, a stray ginger cat sneaks in that James soon calls Bob, played mostly by himself. James starts to take care of Bob and they become inseparable, even coming with him as he busks, turning him into a tourist attraction and setting James on the path towards rehabilitation. A Street Cat Named Bob is based off James Bowen's 2012 book of the same name, which recounts his life on the street and how that all changed when he encountered a stray ginger cat that quickly became a worldwide bestseller. Although in the UK, Bowen was actually a fairly recognised figure because he'd been the subject of several human interest stories, and especially in Covent Garden, where he would often busk with his cat playing music and later selling copies of The Big Issue, and he became almost a bit of a tourist attraction in his own right. Bowen has since moved on into writing full-time and into trying to raise awareness of homelessness and drug addiction. The film is directed by Roger Spottiswood, who is a fairly interesting director in his own right, because his career spans decades, all the way back to the 1970s when he used to edit films for Sam Peckinpah, including the notorious Straw Dogs, before moving into directing full-time. And his career has been very variable. He's done all kinds of different genres, from the likes of the James Bond movie Tomorrow Never Dies, to the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie The Sixth Day, to the relative low of the Stallone vehicle Stop or My Mom Will Shoot. But Spottiswood's other credits also reveal a remarkable number of animal-based projects. He's the director of the classic Tom Hanks comedy Turner and Hooch, which is generally considered to be one of the best dog-based movies. And his most recent film before A Street Cat Named Bob was something that's been recently retitled The Journey Home, that focused on the relationship between a boy and a polar bear. A Street Cat Named Bob is one of the best cat movies ever made. Admittedly, that's not really saying much, considering its main competition is the likes of A Talking Cat, but even still, there's a reason why there are more movies made about dogs than there are cats. And that's because dogs are substantially easier to train. You can very much make them do tricks in front of the camera, which you can then use to create some kind of performance, as it were. You cannot do that with a cat. If you've ever owned one, you know just how uncooperative they can be. They very much do what they want to do. But Spottiswood and his team, they've actually done this fairly remarkable accomplishment here of not only making Bob front and centre in the movie, but giving him a legitimate sense of presence and personality within it. He very much feels like a character. And I do have to admit, I may be slightly biased here in that I really love cats. I am very much a cat person, and so anytime the movie cuts to a big close-up of Bob, which it does on a regular basis, I pretty much go, "Aww." And that's exactly the response the movie wants to elicit out of its audience. It wants to be sweet and adorable. But it has to be said that even with that in mind, Bob is a very remarkable cat, especially when it comes to his relationship with James. The fact that he followed James onto a bus and sniffed him out. There is a remarkable sense of loyalty from this animal. He'll sit on James's shoulder as he walks down the street, or beside him as he plays on his guitar, surrounded by a crowd of people, and it won't be bothered by it. That is very unconventional behaviour from a cat. Normally they're very skittish around other people, but he feels very much at home at James's side. And what Spottiswood does that really enhances Bob's presence in the movie is that not only has he used very careful editing, but also he's very much taken to trying to frame the movie from Bob's perspective to a certain degree. There are definitely moments of cat cam or Bob's POV where he'll run around James's flat. There is a little subplot where he's chasing after a mouse that's also made its home in there. But it gives this sense that the world almost feels threatening from such a tiny perspective. Everything feels enormous and just a little bit intimidating. And this is a movie about pet ownership and companionship, and how that relationship between pet and owner is ultimately reciprocated. Because at the beginning of the movie, both Bob and James are in dire need of help. James has his heroin addiction, he's on the streets, he's got no one to turn to, and Bob, he's got this wound on his leg that's become infected. And how James begins to take care of Bob is that he takes him to the vet and uses his very last money to buy him medication. And that act of kindness and generosity is reciprocated many, many times over by Bob, who is steadfast beside him. With Bob at his side, James suddenly finds a confidence in himself that he didn't really know that he had. But also it allows James to think about someone other than himself. It gives him a sense of responsibility that allows him to get himself into some kind of connection and perspective. But because Bob's there on the street alongside him, it also gives him a unique selling point to the public, because suddenly, with an animal there, people start paying attention to him. Suddenly, his story starts being heard. While there is something cynical to be said about the fact that we pay attention more to animals than humans in plight, there is something ultimately touching about how generous people can be once they become aware of something. Bob's presence ultimately allows them to see what has otherwise previously been invisible to them. And while I've spent so much time talking about a cat, I don't mean to do a disservice to Luke Treadaway as James Bowen, because he's actually fairly brilliant here himself. He really commits to the part. I think, to a certain extent, he's so very natural and authentic as Bowen, and that you completely believe him in the role, that it makes him easy to overlook in favour of his much more showy, furry co-star. But even with that said, that you can tell that Treadaway is very much committed to that performance, right down to things like the accent, in that occasionally his accent does adopt a vaguely Australian lilt, which is a reference to the fact that Bowen spent his early part of his life in Australia, and it was when he moved back to the UK that he ultimately ended up on the streets. Treadaway is very much the human heart at the centre of this movie. You couldn't just make a film entirely about a cat. You need to care about James and his plight, and he does that. He really sells you on his love of his companion. I think it also helps the subplot of James trying to reconnect with his family, especially his father, played by Anthony Head, really works on an emotional level. Head only appears in 3 or 4 scenes, but he's given this very complicated character to play, because on the one hand, we are meant to dislike the fact that he doesn't really look out for his son in the way that he really should do, but he's in this terrible position in that his life to a certain extent has moved on. He's got a new family, he's got a new wife that really disapproves of her junkie stepson and tries to keep James and his father apart. But there is still something inside of Head's performance here that you can recognise as familial pride. To a certain extent, he wants the same thing as James. He wants to have this person back into his life because he is his son at the end of the day, but it's a very tense relationship between them. You can tell that things haven't been right between them for a very long time, and it is quite emotionally affecting when that ultimately comes to its resolution, and it's a combination of Head and Treadaway's performances. Although it's mostly made for a family audience and clearly had its winter release day in mind, given that Christmas and New Year make up so much of its second act, this isn't a film without rough edges given its subject matter. James, as I said, is very committed to highlighting homelessness and drug addiction, and the movie shares his cause, especially in its very earliest scenes, showing James on the street, going through bins, and he's going alongside them with rats, he's struggling to find a place to sleep, and when he can't do that, he ultimately ends up taking drugs to try and get his mind off of it, which leads to a near fatal overdose. And that is some particularly dark material to open your film with, even one that ultimately takes an uplifting route like this one. And I think to a certain extent, the movie isn't sure how to handle those shifts in tone. I don't think Spottiswood handles those particular sides of the film together very well, because you have both the cute cat stuff, and then you have the much heavier scenes about drug addiction. And the movie makes very plain the fact that if James continues the life that he's on, he will die, that life on the street is a killer, and it stands in very much stark contrast to the material elsewhere in the film. And it's in this very weird position, because I do think that parents might want to exhibit caution, especially with very youngest viewers who might be attracted to the fact that there is a cute cat in the movie. These scenes are not entirely suitable for the very youngest of viewers, but it ends up in this very weird place where it doesn't really linger too much on that kind of material, because obviously that's not its main focus, and it's not really appropriate for the audience it's trying to target. But I do think there will be some members of the audience that feel it doesn't go far enough. I think where that's most obvious is towards the end of the film, where James goes cold turkey to try and go clean, and those symptoms of withdrawal are mostly glanced over in a montage. And I think that the film maybe should have paid a little bit more time to that, especially since it serves essentially as the story's climax, with regards to this idea that James is constantly being reminded of his addiction. There are constant lures to his temptation, right down to the fact that his flat in a fairly run-down area, there are drug dealers that he can see outside of his window, and there is very much the concern that he could potentially relapse, that he could potentially end up going back on the path, even as he made so much progress. That is the movie's main conflict and tension there. And so when you have that element that is such a pivotal part of this movie's resolution, the fact that it feels like it's been maybe a little bit skipped over does make it feel like it has been, to a certain extent, watered down for mass consumption. However, there are other problems outside of that. The character of Betty, who I believe was invented for the film and played by Ruta Gerd-Minters, who is Treadaway's real-life girlfriend, and they do have genuine chemistry together in their scenes. She is this hippie type that lives a couple of doors down, and they have a relationship that verges on being romantic, but James has neglected to tell her that he's a drug addict, because she hates drug addicts, because her brother recently passed away. That's whose flat she's moved into. She's essentially gone into her brother's life. And that character, the only reason that she's in the movie is to give James, the character, someone to talk to that isn't a cat. And when they introduce this element, you know exactly where it's going to go. It goes into very predictable territory. You know that 2/3 of the way through the movie, something is going to happen and James's lie is going to be exposed. It gets worryingly close to the manic pixie dream girl archetype, that free spirit that reminds the main character of how to live. She even has the word live tattooed on her wrist. But I can understand why they introduced that character, because this is a relatively thin story. It's ultimately a movie about a man and his cat, and there isn't that much story to tell, so they need to add something to make the story a little bit more substantial. But even with that said, I do think the movie is maybe a little bit guilty of coasting along on just how adorable Bob is. There are stretches of the movie where not a whole lot happens, and it feels like the film is maybe playing a little bit for time. And I do think that the movie would have benefited from having about 10 to 15 minutes taken off of its running time, because it does get close to the 2-hour mark, And this story doesn't need 2 hours to be told, really. You could have very easily told it in just over 90 minutes or so, and it would have benefited from that substantially. But I don't want to appear too harsh on this movie because, at the end of the day, it accomplishes what it sets out to do. It wants to be this uplifting tale of how a cat saved a man's life and brought him on the road to rehabilitation, and it tells that story fairly well. Does it have flaws? Yes, it does. But I didn't really care about them because when I came out of the movie, I had a real smile on my face. This is a movie that genuinely leaves its audience with a warm, positive glow. And it's just a really sweet, light, fluffy movie. And sometimes that's exactly what you want. A Street Cat Named Bob is a largely sweet and very adorable tale about strength and companionship. It's a great film for cat lovers especially, as the movie spends a lot of time around its titular feline, and director Roger Spottiswood manages to coax a sense of personality out of Bob and his doubles, although Treadaway also does well as Bowen and sells his love of his co-pilot. The movie is less sure-footed outside of that though, and while the harsh realities of homelessness and drug addiction stop it from falling into mawkishness, it sits unevenly with the light-hearted cat scenes, and the romance with Ged Minters goes through predictable motions. For the most part, it's an uplifting and slight, if overlong, film with some fluffy charm. Coming up soon, a very different take on poverty from director Ken Loach and I, Daniel Blake. David Oyelowo and Rosamund Pike share a love that shakes the United Kingdom, and Jason Bateman and company are throwing an outrageous office Christmas party. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.